Welcome to the Oxford Smart Space series. We're really pleased you could join us. My name is Laura Ann Edwards. I'm a NASA Datanaut. I am a climate and space strategist and a core member of the Space Initiative, which, by the way, has been renamed the Oxford Space Commerce and Governance Initiative. And you'll see why as we dig into this panel. My three guests today are pioneers in their own right in the areas of space medicine, space law, and in what it means to be a space agency and embrace and shape space policy. At the Space Commerce and Governance Initiative, we keep asking the question about access to space: who, what, when, and why. Because there are so many nuanced answers to those questions, and we believe that asking these questions highlights our very reason for being, which is to investigate and bring heft to the social sciences, to bring them to a par with engineering and aerospace, so that there's a full and robust conversation about this era. So with that, I'd like to bring my guests in. Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. We've broached this topic of access to space: who, what, when, and why. And today we're going to have a conversation about what that means to you personally and what it means for your fields. So I'm going to start with you, Mona, and just the people don't. What do you mean by space medicine, and how in the world did you get there?
So my name is Mona Nasser. I'm the professor in clinical epidemiology and oral health research at the University of Plymouth. So my specific area that I would interact with space medicine is I'm a methodologist. So my interest is how we design research and how we synthesize research to inform decision making, how we do systematic reviews. And space medicine, like any other area, in order to be able to be a good source of evidence for future space operations, it needs to have good processes in place and good quality of evidence in place. So I work with different groups, like some of the space medicine team in ESA, about how we can make that happen and how we can run the systematic reviews. One of the other interests I have is about, so if we want to look at the future of space medicine, we not only have to think about the discoveries that we have, but also about how we approach research in itself for the future one. So how we run clinical trials here might not be the same if you're on the Mars. And that's a question that I'm exploring and working on.
Fantastic. Timiebi, I'll go to you on space law. How did you always want to be involved in space law? How did you get here?
Hi, so nice. Timiebi Aganaba at the School for the Future Society at the College of Global University. The University of Leicester, and really and ended up going to law school. When you graduate from university and do a year's service for the country, posted in the newly Affairs and International Cooperation Department. So that was my foray, and now I basically focus using it on the field of space governance and emerging into this that I think takes, how do all the sectors and together to as each of the countries. So that's really
your audio is breaking up a little bit for me. I don't know, the wizards behind the cameras will try to work on that. And Joseph, I'm going to pivot to you. Folks out there listening, there's a little bit of a lag on the line to Joseph, so the signal's working fine, but bear with us. We're all scattered all over the world tonight. Hi, Joseph. I would ask you the same question. Hopefully people have clicked on the link to see your very interesting and impressive bio. But uh, how did you go? How did you choose to go into government? And how long have you been with the agency? Have you been part of forming the agency? How did that work?
Yes, thanks, Laura. Indeed, was part of the agency getting started here in Rwanda, but even before that, which is how I got into this, is when Rwanda wanted to build her first satellite, which was a 3-year CubeSat that we built in partnership with the University of Tokyo because we didn't have the facilities at the time. And then a space agency was needed, and the rest is history. So yeah, I think one thing has led to the other, but one thing that is undeniable is the hunger that policy really has for insights that can be provided by satellite data.
Fantastic, thank you. And to all of you, when I ask who is space, the first in the question of who is space actually for, how do you approach that question? Anybody want to take that? Mona?
Yeah, I was thinking about the question after I saw the topic of the Smart Space Series. I think the best answer I could come up with is saying it's for the humanities. And the reason I use the word humanity rather than saying everyone is that I don't think everyone necessarily has to go to space or have access to space, but we have to find strategies how we make it accessible that's beneficial for everyone rather than increasing inequality based on the consequences of access of certain space resources.
Well, I think of access as literal access of who will physically go into space. It's also who will benefit from space or who is already benefiting and doesn't know it. Timiebi, how do you define access to space when you think of it as a right, as an issue, as a discussion point?
Most people access to space, they think about so can you hear me?
It's better if you lean forward, I think.
I think most people, when you from the 15 years that I've been in this, you say access to space, that's cool. And so
you're still dropping in and out. Oh dear. I'm gonna pause and come back to you on this because I really want to hear what you have to say, and we'll hand that one to you, Joseph, because it's such a fundamental question, not only of fairness but of perspective, and you're in a unique position to comment on it.
Okay, thanks, Laura. I think, like Mona said, space inevitably will be for everyone. In the beginning, though, I think it's probably going to be for the dreamers. And the reason I say that is usually you do have, whether you think of the Apollo program, which, is very synonymous with, with moonshots, or, obviously very well deserved congratulations to NASA today and literally all of humanity with Artemis launching. But the dreamers kind of will or are setting the pace for those, for the rest to follow. There will be an inflection point, though, like any other technology, where it just becomes democratized, whether it's because of Moore's law. From where my position, I think policy also has a very strong role to play to really bring lower the barriers to entry or to the benefits, like you had mentioned. And there's a point where humanity will start benefiting. And when I hear access to space, indeed there is, getting the hardware up there, but there is also going to be who is in the supply chain. It might be. I was just talking to someone yesterday about the iPhone 14. A lot of you who are aware, is the first mobile phone that has satellite-enabled emergency calling. You could be in the middle of a mountain, and if you dial your emergency number, you now ping a satellite Global Star, and that was made possible because of a ground station we actually put live a few months ago. And they didn't set foot here in Rwanda at all because it was during COVID. We built everything from scratch. But sometimes that is what access to space is. It is providing a service. And then there's also the applications. When we had a volcanic eruption about a year ago, which was next door in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we actually relied on INSAR, interferometric synthetic aperture radar analysis, to actually look for, what was happening beneath the ground, where the epicenters of the earthquakes were, is the lava flow increasing or decreasing, and that kind of analysis. So that is also access to space if you ask someone, like a policymaker, because it literally changes the narrative from should we evacuate 2 million people versus, do we, so I think access to space will be defined differently. From a policymaker perspective, I think, across the spectrum is very, it is, it is for everyone, in that sense that everyone can define it in their own way.
How essential a component is the dream in your work, right? And when you obviously, we've got the space bug, but as a government official and needing to deal with very practical things like budgets and and hardware, how important is the excitement over the big vision space can be? Is there an emotional connection between the Rwandan people and what space means to them? Do you have any sense of that you could share with us?
Yes, indeed, it is, and one key thing about that is, speaks to us is just the age of our demographic. The population, 70% of our population is under 30 years of age. So this is
Amazing.
What speaks to them. And when we launched RASAT-1, the first CubeSat, it went up in November 2019, deorbited April of this year. The excitement when you go to high schools and you take a 3D model of this CubeSat, you're sure that at least you're getting a few future aerospace engineers. So the excitement is very real, but on the policy side of things, again, it just makes asking for or justifying budgets a lot easier, because remember, this is not your traditional 1 year financial year cycle. The capex is going to be big, and the returns are probably going to be multi-year. So having that buy-in from the grassroots really goes a long way.
Fantastic. And welcome back to Timiebi. Hand it back to you to reprise both how quickly how you got into space law, and when we talk about the issue of access to space, literally and emotionally, how do you use that to frame some of your work?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me a bit better now.
Yes, much better. Yeah.
Oh, fabulous. I actually started my career as the first legal team at the Nigerian Space Agency 15 odd years ago. And then from there, I've done several other things, and have basically steered my work now towards an interdisciplinary concept that I call space governance, because it's more than just law. And law, for instance, law is not justice. It just announces the form of justice sought. So law is an instrument that you use to kind of wrap up everything, but it's really not the underlying pieces. So when I think of access to space in the context of my 15 years of this field, I think about it in the context of launch vehicles. So primarily when I started and people talked about access to space, it was really a conversation, say, Europeans wanting to make sure that they had independent access to get to space, so they wouldn't have to rely on the Americans or the Indians or the Chinese, basically everyone wanting independent ways to be able to get to space. That is how I came into the discussion of access to space. Obviously, over the years, this terminology has broadened out to now be talking about who are you talking about?
Got it. So the next one is, what should be in space? What will we bring with us? But I would add to that, what belief systems, what governance systems, what's the baggage we're going to bring? The equipment, the hardware, the best practices. And so, Mona, I'm going to ask you, obviously there's the practice of the science of medicine and of medical research in space, and that's the core focus, but you are also a medical professional looking at human well-being, human health in the long term. Do you feel that there's enough research going on about the broader sense of what it means to be human in space?
Just for clarification, I have a background in dentistry and clinical research. I'm not a medic indirectly, but
Okay.
I work in like medical space medicine, helping when I'm doing research. So I think, that's a very important question, because I think there's also in a lot of discussion of space, people talk, as Tui does talking about, they talk a lot about the launch vehicle, the engineering problems, but we have still a lot of open questions about how the human health would be able to deal with microgravity long term, or with ionizing radiation, and also another kind of big problem, the psychological problem, that being so much disconnected from where we are stemming from and what is the consequences of it, and also that the fact that a lot of our well-being, or who we are, sometimes also depends on a lot of other species. We all of know there's a lot of we are as much as human cells, but also microbes, and we rely on other species beyond human, as to animals or plants, not only for food but also for companionship and emotional connection, and they are also part of who we like, part of the sphere that covers all of us, that we are when we are going to space. So that's, I think that's the kind of, and also one of the, I think the other aspects that probably might be important to think about long term is that about a lot of our identity also depends on how our body looks like, or how our face looks like, and the impact that long-term microgravity ionizing radiation could have on our body can also change who we are, and how those changes could also affect us psychologically or emotionally, and how we respond to it is an open question. And then totally other aspect that kind of we still don't know, is not explored, is that how we would be dealing with human relationships when we are in a smaller group of people going on on a longer mission, and have to spend a lot of more time together, and we have to build different relationship, and how we handle that together. So there's, I think, a lot of, and when you're talking about baggage, is that one of the things I think we always assume is that if we know what the problems we had before on Earth and so on, we can learn on them and improve of them. But what we learned, I think, from a lot of things of the history of humanity, we forget, especially if we get disconnected from all of those problems. So kind of trying to find different ways of how we build the new societies we build, the new communities we build when we are going for space exploration, that can be more resilient or more responsive to those changes and to the responses of it, is quite important. And this is also kind of a smaller thing to add about, just as somebody who has been clinical dentist before, is also people also forget that a lot of our habits of how we eat is a really important part of who we, how we can eat, and how we can nutrition ourselves, but also about how we speak and how we identify yourself, and that's something that we actually don't know what have the long-term effects of be, and how the consequences of it would be.
Well said. Joseph, I was interested in what time frame all three of you think of your work in. I have assumptions about what time frame you may operate in. Obviously, there's the day-to-day work, but when you plan, how far out are you planning? What's the vision scope, or what time frame do you couch your work in?
Okay, maybe a very quick to piggyback off of Mona's comment, I just want to add, I think humans will also probably take with them engineered organisms, very similar to what we've done with GMOs. But the reason for that is we will need this. We don't have the luxury of time where humans have adapted over millennia. If we're going to Mars, or we probably want to, occupy and live as soon as we land. So there will be need to terraform these planets, and Mars, I think, would just be the first of, of many planets that we'll go to. But these engineered organisms will probably will need them to provide the food that we need, fuel, but also probably medicine as well. Just because these are the organisms that our bodies are used to here on Earth. In terms of time frame, I think anyone who is in the space sector will tell you it's a generational play. The Apollo time frame, is what has given birth to Artemis today, or to commercial space, the commercial space industry. So I think it's just a good rule of thumb to think generationally, in 30, 40-year cycles in terms of planning. But then, especially when you're in government, you also need to have, short-term wins. So it's kind of a delicate balance, depending again on the source of funds. A key differentiator today, I think, is because of the increase of commercial enterprise and interest into the space sector. You're probably going to see a lot more riskier ventures being taken, which probably have longer term horizons.
And speaking of your young workforce and population in so much of the world, but in Rwanda, since you're here representing Rwanda, how to maintain that generational enthusiasm, right? You've mentioned on the engineering side, but how can we involve young people in all the other aspects of this transition era and connect it back to opportunities and urgent issues on Earth, right? Understanding that those fields that they're going into have a play in both places.
I think a big part of that is within our outreach programs. At least as far as what we do is very, very heavily invested in outreach programs, but then also the projects that they work on, considering, if someone is going to build, a satellite, and it's probably going to take 2 to 3 years to build, you have them working on 3 or 4 to become an expert, and you just took, about a dozen years of their professional life. So I think really getting them, to test the waters knee deep and get their hands dirty with real national programs. Multinational programs, we don't have the chance right now, but if you see the Artemis launch, which is still fresh in my mind because it launched today, but that was, a very successful partnership, which was led by NASA, but also you had ESA, you had Airbus, and all these other international partners. So I think really getting them involved in really these moonshot programs, but then also intentional outreach programs seem to be the logical way.
Okay, Timiebi, what would you describe as the most urgent issues in space law today, and the greatest misconceptions about space law?
Yeah, so one of the big issues that we're really facing right now is really almost defining what space is. Is it a domain? Is it an environment? Is it a place that Earth principles and Earth law applies? Or is it a place that is completely separate? And these are really challenging notions because, for instance, if you think Earth is an environment, then if we think of what we're doing right now in the climate change and sustainability realms, then is it a domain that should be protected, right? And should things like environmental impact assessments be done in space? So these are the kind of issues that we're grappling with right now, because when you take away space as just this scientific laboratory or this kind of sanctuary, you now have to figure out, okay, if it's going to be a multi-stakeholder environment with different kinds of actors, how are you going to govern those people? And are you going to take Earth rules up there? Does it work in the same context? So that's really the big thing we're trying to figure out right now. How does Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty says that international law applies in space? So which of those laws apply in space, and how will they be implemented? How will the different actors kind of work together? I think that's the biggest challenge we're having right now. Well, not challenge, but opportunity.
So I get the question often, who is making space law? Like literally which bodies are, who's represented at the table talking about any of this?
Yeah, and this is where we talk about space governance, right? And we basically say there are institutions, there are instruments, there are processes, and space governance is really how they all work together and interact and interrelate with the different kinds of stakeholders that are emerging. So classically, we had the United Nations, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in Vienna, which is where public international law, like the major treaties that people have heard about, and a treaty is an instrument that governs the relations between states. That's where they negotiated the regime when there were only two actors in space. And then they stopped making these treaties in about 1979. And then we had a period between 1979 and 2000 where really not that much was going on. It was still much of the same. And then obviously since 2000, since we've had innovations in miniaturization and in off-the-shelf components, we've just had an increased amount of actors. But states didn't have the appetite for these treaty regimes. So what you now see is non-binding principles and guidelines. You see coalitions making their own self-governance regimes. So we're now really in a point where we first started off with hard international law instruments. Now we moved into soft instruments, and now it's more about the national approach. So countries are establishing rules and laws that say this is how we interpret those international rules, and this is what's going to apply to our citizens. So a lot more people are involved now, because if you're part of a space industry group or a coalition, you guys may come up with your own rules. Look at Elon Musk. He said that in the terms of service for Starlink satellites, they basically said they were going to regulate Mars. So, so different groupings at this point are making their own rules.
Okay, so there are quite a few countries that have declared that they have some version, some gradation of a space program. Does announcing that and forming the space agency automatically get them a seat in this conversation? And if not, what do under or less represented nations need to do what would you recommend? How can they participate and more fully?
That's a really interesting question. And I think at one point there was this kind of discussion, especially to developing countries. If you guys want to be on the table, just have an asset in space. Now we're moving to the point where people are saying, you don't need assets in space. There's already so much assets and so much junk. You can be part of the conversation by focusing on the downstream. So like at the end of the day, I think there's lots of different stories and narratives, and everyone needs to come at it depending on why are you interested in doing space in the first place. I believe that the priority right now is separating the myth and the narrative from reality, because there's a lot of storytelling in space, there's a lot of mythology, and people now need to realize, what is this thing actually about? Why do we care about it? Why is it relevant to us? I think it behoves everyone to have that serious conversation first.
Fantastic, thank you. Mona, I'm going to ask you an audience question because it's such an interesting one, and I apologize in advance if I have mispronounced your name. Ekjot Singh asks, if humans were to go to Mars, or presumably anywhere else, and reproduce, how would Mars' third of Earth's gravity affect the process of reproduction?
Okay, thank you for the question. First of all, I have to say I was enjoying Timiebi's explanation of space law as much as everybody in the chat were talking about that. And I think one of the dangerous things is to asking me that question is I'm a clinical epidemiologist, so I'm very uncomfortable making speculation when I don't have evidence. And that's a very speculative question because it's quite about the future, and there's no way we really have like a way to kind of test it before. We could have like doing the studies that can give us an idea, but a lot of it's speculation. And I think a lot of speculation you will see in that answering that question would be like, if we lose bone mass or lose muscle mass, probably we would have the same when we are going to Mars. And you've seen, like, if any of you watched Expanse, that they were talking about people who couldn't deal with gravity because they had the body adapted to it. But I think the difficult part of your question is what we don't know is that how the gravity would affect the embryological process before even the child is formed and become born, because there are so many little processes happening that shapes the movement of the different layers, and how our sensory develops, how our ears develops, how our vision develops, how our senses develop, and how in each of those small developments the gravity can affect and change it. So I think any speculation I make is a very, very huge from distance from the future, because that would be the interesting ones that would shape all of those details of him. But actually it takes me back to the issue. What I'm interested is about, okay, in order to be answered to a question that you're asking and preparing for somebody for the future, how should we design it? How we should be approach even doing the research part? Do we should speculate by doing something we did in microgravity? Should we having somebody to give birth to do that to see what had happened? Or should we take certain previous stages of the development of a child and test it, and is that ethical or not? And so that comes back to the original issue. I think that's the most fundamental part before we work in the speculation about the long-term space, is that we actually, the way we do research now might not be enough to be answer the question that you have, because it wouldn't give you enough details and data to make that prepare us for answering the question or prepare for that scenario in the future.
Do you think it's inevitable that we have some range of human augmentation for extended time and space?
I would be surprised if we would not have it. I've actually had a PhD student who's a speculative designer who actually wasn't looking specific space only, but also other parts about thinking as human body as a speculative design project and how you would approach that. And I think I think the issue behind it would be more fundamentally what we consider human and the borders of human body. Like, where does human body ends? Is that, are we really, our identity is where our skin is? And if, for example, you have seen people who have lost their arm, when they want to replace their arm, do they replace the arm as it looks human, or do something more augmented that makes them, give them some other abilities to adapt to that? And so it goes back a lot to also the question of human identity and who we are, and what we consider, and what communities we would perform in the future, because the people who would be going to space community are not the same people who would be in a community on Earth. So certain things that might become a stigma here might be a positive thing in the future. So my first thing is, like, I think augmentation will happen. That would be my personal opinion. But I think if it doesn't happen with some real discussion about the psychological, philosophical, conceptual issues that we have, it might become a problematic thing in building the communities in the future if it's not considered that in that perspective.
I agree. Timiebi, I had wanted to ask you a question about how much in the space arena is the commercial sector ahead of the law? And we have an audience question from Max Ma, asking, how could the private sector and potential decentralization, diversification, and democratization or how could they aid? I guess he's asking, How could the private sector aid potential decentralization, diversification, and democratization of space exploration?
Trying to get those 3 words in my head and not confused.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, I take it as how can they be a force for good, and the other piece of it is how is the sector leading policy, because it has to have regulations and some norms.
Absolutely. Here I will refer to Professor Melissa Durkee and her paper on interpretive entrepreneurs, which really talks about the role that these new commercial actors are playing as norm entrepreneurs and as people who are influencing the governance process. So, and also I will refer you to Harvard Business School have a case study online about Planetary Resources, the company that basically spurred the Space Resources Act of the US in 2015. So it lays down in that case study really the challenge that you had this private company that wanted to do space mining and wanted to do all these things, and then were being hit with this challenge that the first thing a mining company needs is security of tenure. Like, are you going to be able to keep the thing that you're going to work to get? And so the case study will walk through all the lobbying activities, stuff that I'm calling space governance, all the things that had to be done to get this new rule established. Not only that, there are other examples. For instance, the US is trying to show that you can do in-orbit transactions that basically don't amount to appropriating outer space. And it's really interesting because the company that won a contract from NASA to a space mining contract basically won that for $1. So they basically put a bid for $1 for this contract that will be used as precedence to show that in-orbit transactions are legal. And that's a company making a big statement. And basically, if you look at the press articles about it, they said, we just basically used it to get in the conversation. So private actors have a significant role to play right now.
And what time frame do you look at your work in? You, Timiebi?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, so over the past 15 years, I mean, that I've been in the space sector, it's dramatically changed from all the readings and things that I was reading about 15 years ago were all quite speculative, right? They were talking about all these things that were going to happen in the future. So I think most of the people that write about space are future focused. But now the speed in which things are happening. I mean, I heard that at the International Telecommunications Union last year, there were applications for about 1 million satellites. And I'm quoting Michael Byers here from the University of British Columbia. I mean, the speed in which things are happening means that we are, those of us who traditionally were futurists, are having to really focus on the now and, like you say, catch up. So, I mean, I think in all streams, but as an African, and as Joseph rightly said, the future is the African youth. And so I'm thinking about what should the youth of today, how do we prepare them? Because they're the ones that are going to be doing the space mining and are going to be living on Mars.
That's a perfect segue, and let's keep all the guests up for this one. Let's talk about the Global South. We talk about it a lot in that the wanting to have all the voices and the population of the future fully at the table. And so what proactively can be done to to engage, to connect space for Earth across the Global South, all of that. Thoughts? I know, Mona, we all have thought about this. Why don't you start?
Yes, please to start. Okay. Yeah, no, it's a very, very important topic, and I totally agree. And so it might be not everybody out there knows that I'm also originally Iranian. So I do know I've been lived in different countries in different contexts. And I think I start with one of the areas that I work in is one of the things I do is like in addition to my professional job as being a clinical epidemiologist, I organize futurism workshops. So we imagine we are in a space future and try to imagine how the life would look like it differently. It is not only for like a game and also futurism, but it's also about giving people a speculative scenario to rethink very complex challenges. And working with different groups from different cultures in different countries, one of the things I learned is a lot like how the lived experience people have from different areas brings in some different perspectives about both the issues and the problems and the solution of it. And I think that's a very important thing that people forget about, that when there's sometimes the reasons we cannot solve certain complex problems like complex climate change or other issues that are happening, or even with the global pandemic, because we are missing a lot of the lived experience that exists, that people have managing different challenges and up and downs of it. And like one of the places I work a lot with is Philippines. They have so many disasters happening on a very short time space. So they have a very kind of connection with how to deal with different challenges of the geological challenges around them, and the experience they bring and the knowledge they bring in about how do you respond and how the questions they ask, which all could be also important question we might have looking at the future space exploration. So from that perspective, it's just, I think, fundamentally it's important to engage them because they bring that knowledge that it doesn't exist. But there is a lot of, as Joseph can explain better than me, there's a lot of policy and structural challenges to make it happen. And sometimes especially when people cannot see that this is anything accessible to them, the feeling that this is reachable, it doesn't kind of trigger the curiosity and the motivation to do it. So initiative like having space agencies in an organization, or having some kind of independence, or initiative like International Space University that brings in people and provides scholarship, provides a venue that makes the discussion reachable. Suddenly, as it moves from being some unreachable, impossible dream to a reachable goal, and that is a very key point, first step to channel people's curiosity and motivation and work to say, okay, maybe we can make it happen. And then as the next step is to building an infrastructure that can actually channel it properly to go to there, which is the more difficult part, especially depending on which country and how, based on what political structure they work, whether they can provide that or not, or the stability of it. And then also the question comes whether it should be a governmental organization, or maybe it should be a non-profit, or other structures that help to channel those discussion to bring that engagement and involvement in.
Well, and thank you. And beyond this idea of engaging populations and the young population in particular in the global South, Joseph, what are I don't want to put you in an awkward position, so I don't want to put you into politics, but more just a tipping point that gives the global South, and that's a big, I mean, it's obviously a giant part of the world, but what is the tipping point for there to be a little more balance, or a new situation in terms of the players? What will it take? Is it hundreds of ground stations that are controlled by the individual countries changing those economics? Is it more launch? What do you think is the tipping point for some closer parity in terms of policy?
I think this is a tricky one because it's a bit it's probably unrealistic to disassociate space policy with ongoing politics of the particular countries. So I think we will see an increasing theme where politics actually extends into space policy, or at least implementation. And I think that will inform alliances. I think that will inform capability development, or locations used for the ground segment, as well as capacity building. So I think space is just naturally one of those ways that will lend itself to be just a natural extension for ongoing politics from a realistic perspective. I don't see that changing in the short term.
Do you think in the midterm, though, that the commercial sector could disrupt that in a big way?
I think there is opportunity for that, but you also have to remember even the commercial sector itself is also operating within a particular framework of home station, if you may, of particular countries themselves. So that's also another area that is still TBD. Theoretically speaking, if I was writing a PhD thesis, I would say yes, this is the future. But realistically speaking, I think it's a bit different.
So Timiebi, how does all of this change if, when, not if, viable mining of something precious enters the conversation? So whether that is finding enough source of water or precious metals, rare earth metals that, it will change the economics and the future of humanity. So this could happen relatively soon.
Yeah, I mean, at Arizona State University, we have a mission to Psyche, the first metallic asteroid that is potentially mostly made of nickel. So this conversation is already right about now, because if we get to that asteroid next year, it's the size of Massachusetts. And then they come up and they say it's 70% nickel, 20% gold, 10% this. I mean, then what? I think at this point, everybody is clear to say, well, it's not going to affect us here on Earth because no one's thinking about bringing those minerals down to Earth. Everyone is talking about in situ resource utilization, which means using the resources in space for in-space manufacturing and the in-space economy. But from a global South perspective, the question is always, how does this integrate back to Earth? So we talk about commodity integration. And even if everyone wants to say it doesn't affect Earth, because space people love to say that the best thing about space is it's completely disconnected from Earth. But from a global South perspective, the big question is commodity integration. How does it affect life on Earth? And that's the young people are increasingly having perspectives on this. I published a special issue in the New Space Journal that was the Next Generation Youth Perspectives, and they had ideas for benefit sharing regimes, for environmental protection, and all those kind of topics.
Well, wouldn't it explode markets? I always. Okay, so
Yes,
we have. Yeah. So here's a broader question from Ingrid in the UK, and whoever wants to take it, please do. How do you envision humanity coming together to develop a common vision for space, given different priorities and business competition across the globe? Is that it? I do think that many of us kind of hold on to a Star Trek Federation sensibility that we think that it will somehow come together. And yet, if we don't try, we don't get there. We don't get any closer. I treat it as a serious question of what are the fundamentals for at least having a common understanding and vocabulary and set of expectations for this near space future. I'll frame it that way.
I'm happy to start. One of my favorite policy people, Laura Delgado, in a 2011 article in Space Policy Journal, she wrote an article called "When Inspiration Fails to Inspire." And I just thought it was a brilliant article because the American perspective of this narrative of Apollo and Star Trek, I don't think is a global story. I don't think that the space story is a global one. And in America, where I am at, then they are adamant that the whole world was watching Apollo and the whole world was in awe. Yes, they were, but everyone had very different ideas and sentiments. Some people were scared to death about it. Some people were excited. Some people don't believe it's even real. So there's not a united story. And so in Laura Delgado's article, she says that it doesn't sound cool, but we have to make space boring. And then we will get a global story. And by making space boring, She means talking about things like, what does this thing actually do, right? So obviously the big topic everyone is talking about right now is that the biggest problem facing us is climate, right? So if you want a global vision, we need to get together about something that every single person is affected by, and then say, how does space contribute to solving that issue? But you can't frame it like we have to care about space and climate because Earth is going to die and we need somewhere else to go. No, it's like, we want to save Earth. We're all in Earth. What can we do? What helps us think about that? And space has so many things to contribute to the issue of climate. So for me, a global vision starts with looking at our global priorities. And I think everyone loves talking about the SDGs, right? The Sustainable Development Goals. I'm like mixed about that, but we need these kinds of things that affect everyone, and then come together and say, what does everyone agree that space can contribute to that specific problem the whole world is facing?
Which brings us to the why. The why we go, and why it's more than exploring. It's the why we go. Do we go to get answers that will improve life on Earth? I would argue that it already has, and even if it's not very well communicated. I see you nodding, Mona. Is there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with Timiebi, because also what you're saying, it's kind of really resonated with me, because when we are trying to work with people in speculative scenarios, one of the things that I have commonly seen is that what grounds people and what connects them is not the common dream or vision, is the common problems that ground them, because they all can relate to it and they kind of want to come together to deal with it. And I think there's also the issue about people overthink diversity means that you cannot find commonalities, but diversity sometimes is the most powerful thing that connects us and kind of bring us together, because it brings the different visions we have on the same perspective. Regarding the question of why we should go to space, I totally agree with you, Laura. It's the issue about we can't. It's not only about space exploration, but it's about how to solve our problems here. But I also want to say is space is also part of who we are and where we are, because we are the planet Earth is in space. It's not like we are totally disconnected from this kind of area of space as something else that we go there and then come back. It's just part of it. Affects us in many ways. The sun affects us, the other planets affect us. Every time there's a sun flare or so on, it has an effect on our electromagnetic system. So and it goes back, I think it's something that Timiebi said earlier about what does space mean, and I think that's where the question becomes interesting, because if you see space as something disconnected, you do lab experiment, come back, that's a different way of seeing it, is that rather than recognizing and acknowledging that Earth is in space, and this connection, we need to understand our connection with them to understand what are the future impact it can have for us. And so I think space exploration itself is somehow recognizing who we are as humanity on Earth.
I love that. So Joseph, on the why, countries have tough choices to make of what to do with their GDP and their resources and their precious population. Why has Rwanda made this investment? And what should the world know about Rwanda's vision and plans for being a space actor?
Great. So there's a very famous quote by Mark Twain, which says, 20 years from now, you will be disappointed by the things that you didn't do than by the ones that you did. So throw off the boldness, sail away from the safe harbor, catch the trend winds in your sails, explore, dream, discover. I think that sums up anyone who is willing to venture, whether it's at the individual level, the corporate level, or even at the national level, which is what we did. The demand for us, even if it was primarily it was demand driven by the ministries, the users of the applications. I think you also want to the spirit of entrepreneurship, which has defined the space sector of recent, over the last couple of years. I think answers the why, just because it's a force multiplier for sure. to maybe add a bit to what Timiebi eloquently put forward, I want to say one of the best ways to get others, especially those in the global south, to participate is not really just about, okay, climate, for example, is a big deal. Great, no one doubts that. Apart from, the few that don't believe in science, but let's assume we're speaking to, logical minded people. The key thing here to get them on is actually to show them their role and how they can actually add value. So if there's a part to play, for example, if you're in the equatorial region, for example, when Apollo was going up, like we're talking about, you had a lot more from South Africa interest on the African continent because they added so much value with, the ground station that, in the TTNC up to the moon. And this is where the more you show other countries and other players that they can actually add value, it is going to get them on board beyond just, explaining to them about how important these issues are.
Thank you. And as we come to us here, then of course there's more questions and we won't be able to get to all of them. And I know we've touched on a lot of different things, but that's the nature of this ongoing set of conversations about access to space, who, what, when, and why. We'll keep asking these questions to many such panels because we need to tease out all of these things. So I would just ask you if there are any quick closing thoughts or burning things that we didn't get to that you want to put out. Mona, anything you want to leave us with?
I think one key thing I would say is that I think future we don't have to build structures the same way as we built on Earth if you're looking at space, and it's an opportunity to rethinking. And one of them is, I think, the medical research system and how it can be more responsive and more quicker to be evidence-based. And I think the whole what happened the last few years to a lot of people around the world kind of shows how a more responsive medical research system can make a huge change. So I think that's an opportunity to explore for the future.
So a better prescription for human health and well-being, and a bolder, more nimble medical system. Okay, Timiebi?
Yeah, I think that my first thing to people is always that you need to look within before you start looking without. And essentially an emerging terminology is this term space sector capture when we're talking about developing countries, and it's mainly directed to China, right? And because a lot of people are fearful about what China is doing. And so this new term space sector capture is heralded as a threat to space sustainability. I would just love all actors to look at themselves when they look at the definition of space sector capture and their partnerships with developing countries or other actors and say, let's take away China and let's see how have we done space sector capture. And then they can move forward and start denigrating others. Thank you.
Well said. Joseph, I'm gonna give you pretty much the last word here. Well, I won't tempt you. I'll just let you say.
Well, I think it's a good time to be alive for the sector, and the reason it's not your typical cliche. I've really seen a difference, for example, from the Apollo days, which got us to very significant moonshots and heights, but the increased interest from policymakers today, who are not primarily defense policymakers, I think is very, very critical to the uptake. The interest from the youth, I use the statistic from our country, but that's very similar for a lot of new space. You see a lot of younger people, but then also just more entrepreneur interest from the commercial sector. I think these are three trends that I think really give me hope for and encourage me a lot for the space sector today, irrespective of all the other EOs that and unknowns that we have, whether it's on the space gov side, etc.
A warm thank you to all three of you. Thank you for your patience and your ability to jump around with me. But you can see why starting to put our arms around these topics. We want a varied panel. We don't want to. We want to keep it as broad and as interesting as humanity is. Our problems and our aspirations. So thank you, and thank you to the audience at home.